In this session of our video, we're going to analyze what is represented on screen, what actually appears on screen, and how that also create barriers and issues of inclusivity. So far we have discussed how video games are played, what kind of actions are necessary to play a video game. We have also discussed how generates create feelings and emotions through a variety of actions and in different moments. But we haven't really discussed about what is visible on screen, what do we get to see, and how that in itself very often forms a primary element of attraction to the video game. Very often we look at images of a video game and we feel like we would like to play that game. But actually very often the opposite also happens, and this is something that is perhaps less visible and less discussed. But sometimes what we see on screen when a video game is running or performing actually makes a lot of people feel that that game is not really for them. It's not really made intentionally for them as a kind of audience. So I'm thinking in particular about video games that represent violence, or games that represent a unique male hero that is saving the world through the exercise of brute force. That is games that are about destruction and killing and so on. Even though we might think that those games are theoretically available for everyone, for anyone who wants to play them, actually they tend to exclude a large number of people. Now obviously this does not mean that games should be made for everyone all the time. It is absolutely fine to make games as much as a movie or a book, having a specific target audience in mind. But at the same time, when analyzing video games, we should pay much more attention to what is actually represented, what kind of strategies have been used by the designers to represent their fictional world of the video game, and also how those forms of representation have a sort of perception, convey a sort of perception of the world, and also really shape the expected player of their game while potentially excluding others. So we need to pay attention to representation. Quite a lot has changed in the game industry over the past few years. Many AAA video games, blockbusters made for like a large audience, are now made actually paying much more attention to issues of representation. So they tend to represent characters of diverse genders and race in order to be more open and more welcoming to a variety of audiences. And we've also seen, as we're going to discuss in another section, the rise of independent video games, which have opened the ways and the number of strategies used by video games in their techniques of representation. However, even that sort of increasing this, let's say, the number of races and genders represented on screen, that may not actually be enough or sufficient to create a more inclusive environment. So I would like to discuss this through one example that you might be familiar with or not familiar with. It's actually a very popular video game. The game is Horizon Zero Dawn, produced by Guerrilla Games in 2017, and originally released for the Sony PlayStation 4 console. So Horizon has been praised by many commentators for its representation of gender. It is a game set in a post-apocalyptic world where the world is populated by these animals that are actually machines that were made by humans and now have replaced humans in this sort of new post-apocalyptic scenario. There are a few humans that are still alive and they organize in communities, and you as a character play the role of Aloy. Aloy is a girl who needs to essentially save the world and bring it back to humanity and to and help humanity to sort of return to planet Earth. So it's a game that has a lot of environmental concerns, that speaks plenty about issues of environmentalism. There are many warnings about how the use of technology might take the lead and overdo the intentionality of human beings and create scenarios where we are no longer in control of what technologies can do. There are many claims about how this can destroy our nature and so on. The first thing that really appears evident to the player is that the character is a woman and is a very strong character. She can perform actions in the environment that in many other video games would have been considered only to be performed by men. Obviously, there is like the previous case of Lara Croft in Tomb Raider, another important series. However, the character of Lara Croft was very sexualized, so it was presented there mostly for the male pleasure. Imagine that the player would be a man rather than, let's say, a more kind of diverse audience. Aloy is instead very far from being sexualized in the game. She is there as an heroic character, someone who is capable of saving the world. Now, all these issues have contributed to praise the game Horizon as a good example of gender inclusivity. However, there are also some issues that we need to take into account when looking at this game. The author Stephanie Jennings in 2022 published an article on the journal Convergence where she claims, and I quote, that Horizon Zero Dawn fits into repetitious design patterns in which players perform as an exceptional individual whose actions are based in combat and who is not beholden to democratic decision-making. So even though Aloy is this sort of apparently very progressive character, if we start looking at what she's actually doing in the game, what kind of actions she's performing and what roles she's taking in this new environment, she's actually sort of embedded in that culture of violence and oppression that was previously attributed to male characters. So she exercises violence on the nature surrounding her, even though, for instance, some of these enemies that she has to fight with are machines. They are not exactly humans or living beings, but they're still a kind of conscious machines in a sense. And the surrounding environment is something that she can exploit and take advantage of in ways that are not dissimilar to what would have happened in many other video games. And there is also this sort of claim in the story of the game that that character as a hero has the authority to save the world, therefore to decide what the world really is about and how it should look like. That in itself is part of an authoritarian perception of the hero as a main character, which is anything but progressive or democratic or even really environmentally conscious. Stephanie Jennings argues that this imagination of the character derives from a very influential publication from 1949 by Joseph Campbell, who wrote the book The Hero with a Thousand Faces. In that book, Joseph Campbell was proposing the idea of the monomyth. The argument was there is a singular mythological narrative whose fundamental structure reappears in many cultures around the world in different ways. And that structure was essentially posing this singular individual hero in charge of saving the world. And the hero will be saving the world by, for instance, gaining skills with some magic weapons or having some magic helpers and assistants. But mostly the role of saving the world was in the hand of a single individual who would be, who had the authority of turning the destiny and the story of the world. Now, the book in itself has been largely critiqued, actually. It is very oversimplifying and reductive to say that there is only a singular narrative in all mythologies of the world. It's actually very far from that. But the book in itself was extremely influential at the time, to the point that even in game design programs that train the future game designers, this book is very often used as an example of how to write a story, how to write a narrative for your video game. So as a result, even a game like Horizon Zero Dawn, which tries to be progressive and tries to represent a sort of diverse environment, a diverse character, they fall into the trap of reusing these sort of authoritarian claims that are made in this text, the story of the monomyth. And as Stephanie Jennings argues, the story of the monomyth has also became visible outside of what is represented on screen. For instance, in 2014, we had what was called at the time the GamerGate campaign. The GamerGate campaign was an online campaign that was making claims against the presence of women or diverse subjects in video game culture. It was a very reactionary movement, mostly made by male gamers who felt attacked by the presence of a diverse audience, for instance, in the game industry. And they felt that their freedom to express themselves was under attack. Actually, I mean, there was obviously no attacks on anyone's freedom. Anyone is obviously free and should always be free to make any video game they like. But there was at the time a movement that was trying to raise the issue of what is actually get represented on screen, and does it really enable diverse audiences to engage with video games? So that question really kind of touched a sensitive issue because many overreacted to that. And one of the arguments that was made in that campaign was that the gamer, after saving the world in so many video games, they were now in charge of saving the real world from the attack of these new enemies, these diverse libertarian characters who wanted to open up video game culture. So it is a very influential narrative, a narrative that might give entitlement to some very dangerous practices and way of behaving. So we might perhaps move a bit farther from the issue of representation and think, for instance, in terms of identification, which is a slightly more subtle and perhaps more important way of looking at these issues. The author Adrian Shaw, in the book published in 2014, Gaming at the Edge, Sexuality and Gender at the Margins of Game Culture, she argues that, in the quote, identification focuses primarily on the relationship between players, audiences, and text, while also noting the unique aspects of that relationship when games are played with others in a variety of contexts, online and offline. So the issue of identification essentially brings us to question not really what is represented on screen, but how it is represented. If there are, for instance, diverse characters, that's obviously a nice gesture of inclusivity, but it does not necessarily enable a diverse audience to be really engaged with the video game. What might actually make the difference is putting those characters in diverse roles in the game. So it's not just a matter of replacing this male heroic figure with a female body. It's also a matter of perhaps rethinking the roles of those characters, the roles of the hero in a video game, and perhaps also in our real-life world. So video games have the potential of inspiring people. It's a very pervasive medium that can create stories and narratives that are played by many and that really inspire many, and also perhaps inspire the perception of the real-life world that surrounds us. So it is important to start paying attention to those issues and look at how differently we can present heroes and characters that are not necessarily only there to exploit the environments that surround them or exercise violence against others.